Hi there, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'm going to be your moderator and sometimes participant in today's conversation. Just a few details to go through before we dive into today's topic. First of all, today's session is completely live. You will see no slides, it's all conversation. If you would like to become a part of that conversation, you can do so in two ways. You'll see a nice wide chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's also a Q&A tab. I'll be keeping an eye on both of those as we go through today's conversation. The other one is, again, if you're with us live, right down underneath the screen, there's an emoji button, all positive emotions, fortunately. Feel free to give us applauses, give us thumbs up if you don't have anything specific to say as we go through the conversation. So, turning our attention then to why we're all here today, one of the things procurement always wants to do, despite our natural focus on the bottom line, is to have the opportunity for top line impact. And that's going to be our focus in the conversation today. Most specifically, how procurement can help drive revenue without accepting future costs. It's certainly part of our natural ambition, but we need to be prepared to tell the difference between revenue generating initiatives that will work and initiatives that seem like a good idea, but will actually gobble up any of the revenue that we had hoped to generate. I want to bring a guest up on stage with me. I'll be joined today by Richard Ham. Rich is the CEO of Finetune. And he and I are going to go through and not only discuss these revenue opportunities, but also answer any questions that you may have about them. So, hey, Rich, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Kelly. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. Now, as we get started, I thought this was uniquely appropriate given the fact that we're talking about revenue. We a lot of times ask how people found procurement or how procurement found them, but you found procurement while working in sales at a uniform supplier. And I'd be interested to hear about how having that as part of your past experience influences the way that you support procurement at Finetune.
Yeah, in my early to mid 20s, I was a seller, as you said, for a uniform supplier, and I think what the observation that I made that led to my starting our company Fine Tune was that even with the smartest buyers, it just so happened I was selling a service that I would argue is among the, if not the most complex of all indirect services, and the complexity of the
Yeah.
expense just always gave me the upper hand. I mean, even the smartest buyers that I dealt with, people way smarter than me, had that I there was always just a few things that they didn't know. When there's more to know, there are more unknown unknowns, and the unknown unknowns tend to lurk beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And we were really good at exploiting. If a buyer got 95% of a particular contract negotiation with me right, we were still going to be pretty good at exploiting the 5% they got wrong to the tune of 25 to 35% hard dollar cost
Yeah.
over time. And so I felt like, as you consider expenses on a spectrum from simpler widgets to the most complex services, I thought, procurement is the most vulnerable and most in need of some help at the complex service end of the spectrum. And so that's kind of, going back to the question I've been asked in other sessions from you guys. That's how I found procurement, was by selling to them, and also how I found my way to helping our clients in procurement was by, deploying assistance with some of their more complex expenses.
Well, I can certainly validate your comments about uniforms being complex. If you are someone that has never sourced uniforms, all I can say is uniforms are like the hold my beer category of procurement, if for no other reason than because it's intensely personal. And of course, therefore, HR a lot of times is involved as an internal stakeholder. And yet, does it get any more fun than uniforms? Okay, don't tell Alex Carlson. I love facilities, but uniforms were a pretty great category as well. Now, as we think about how your ability to help procurement achieve their objectives, right? Starting with uniforms, but expanding into other of these categories, it isn't just about savings. Procurement's increasingly pushing their impact towards that top line. Are you seeing a trend around this where there's actually increased focus coming from procurement trying to push themselves towards top line impact? And if that is something that you're seeing, What do you think is ultimately behind that trend?
I definitely have noted a trend in the last, I call it 2, 3, 4 years. I'm hearing more and more frequently my clients talking about a departmental focus on revenue
Mm.
generation. Now, I think your audience deserves, disclaimers or caveats. That the the person you're talking with today, I encounter this phenomenon through the prism of our work. Our work focuses on, complex indirect services and sourcing and managing them on a continuous basis for clients throughout North America. And so that's the prism that I have encountered the revenue generation strategy through. And so I think it has almost always had a linkage to expense management and strategies our clients want to use, but they don't have the purse strings and they need to find the money to invest in better strategies for managing expenses. But as you and I discussed offline a couple of days ago, you know, there are a lot of reasons probably that the trend exists, and I think some of them are more broad and big picture, where it's just, you know, procurement folks are smart enough to understand there's two sides to the ledger. There's expenses and there's revenue, and they think they can help with both. And they'd like to play a role in signing their names to some big wins. And there aren't a whole lot of better ways to get attention in a big organization than revenue generation. It's a great path to leadership. And so, I think there are a lot of reasons. In my world, I tend to come across it mostly as it relates to freeing up money to better manage expenses.
Yeah. Now, when you see a procurement team that's starting to talk about this, that's thinking about joining the trend, what tend to be the specific strategies that they plan to use? So it's okay, great. We've made the decision. We're going to try to impact revenue generation. What tends to happen next? What does procurement typically start to either pursue or evaluate as an option?
Well, there are a handful of the most ubiquitous strategies, and I suspect we'll probably get into their relative
Yeah.
effectiveness as the conversation goes forward. So for now, I'll just kind of list them and describe, how they tend to be deployed. One of the most excuse me, one of the most common that I see is retroactive auditing for the purposes of just generating refunded monies that related to past overcharging, past overspending with a particular supplier. And frankly, there's going to be a couple of common themes I think that run through a lot of our discussion today, and I would say that one of the driving factors in a lot of these strategies has been, and we're a bit of a dinosaur in our arena. We've been around 23 years. We were founded in 2002. So we lived through the Great Recession, and I saw in real time how, corporate procurement departments and numerous other corporate departments were aggressively leaned out when times got tight. And today, I think I've often said the average procurement resource is being asked to do the work of three people,
Yeah.
in comparison to what they were tasked with in, say, 2007. Even as healthier economic times returned, I don't come across many at all procurement departments that have been restaffed to historical levels, especially when you're normalizing for spend under management. And
Yeah.
so this has forced the hand of procurement in many respects. They know that they're not able to engage in the joust with their vendors over the actual money being spent after contracts go live. They, I had a client at a Fortune 100 enterprise say to me a couple of years back, and it kind of stuck with me. Said it's all we can do to lob contracts over the wall and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And so, retroactive auditing is a perfect example of how the hand has
Mm.
been forced. Maybe in 2007, we were able to more in real time stay on top of what was happening with a particular expense and take corrective action when we see something that looks amiss. Now it's, oh, let's go back 3 years and see how bad it is, because we've been drinking from a fire hose for the last 3 years,
Yeah.
and this is all we can do. And so, that's going to be a common thread. But retroactive auditing, certainly a very common one. What else? Um, Rebates, okay, supplier rebates. Now it's interesting, and once again, we're going to be able to tie back to leaned out procurement departments that are kind of forced to adopt convenience based solutions.
Mm.
A lot of times, rebates come from aligning with, whether it's a GPO. Sometimes I've even seen them woven into IFM programs
Yeah.
where you have and there's once again you wound up in this place your hand was forced to pursue the convenience-based solution, and it comes with a revenue generation component. So that's one of the nice things that comes out of the relationship, but I suspect we'll get into some of the imperfections too as we go forward. Signing bonuses, very common one. And I think this is one you see more and more of as you get up into the Fortune 5,000, the Fortune 1,000, the Fortune 100, when the dollar volume gets big enough that suppliers are willing to scratch a big check on the front end. But it can be an effective tool if done right, even in the lower and middle market, and yet as we'll probably dig into, it's often not done right,
Yeah.
for various reasons. And even payments, I'm seeing leveraged here and there as a revenue generation strategy. So those are a few of the most ubiquitous that I'm noting in the marketplace.
And not to suggest at all, Rich, that procurement wouldn't be altruistic about any of this, but I think it's fair to question, okay, based on how our performance is measured and incentivized, where does this, in terms of priority, fall amidst our workload? So when we think about the most traditional procurement performance metrics being, spend under oversight, spend under management,
Mm-hmm.
savings potentially, maybe something around risk, maybe sustainability, maybe diversity, where are you seeing revenue generation through? And I know you talked about sort of three different sample strategies there. How does that and the results that procurement might be able to uncover play into how performance is measured?
I can't say that I've really seen it woven into
Mm.
incentive plans yet, at least and I think it's probably because the trend is still on the way up, and there may be some organizations that have actually injected incentive elements related to revenue generation, or at least given some sort of dollar for dollar treatment of revenue generation along with savings targets, which of course it should be my view of a lot of the ways that we could go on for days about my issues with procurement department incentive plans, but I think ultimately money's money, and so I think that if a category manager generates $500,000 on the front end of a deal, that should be treated no differently than any other expense relief they might have produced. But I can't tell you that I've noted specific performance metrics, at least as it relates to the buyer's paycheck, that have revolved around revenue generation yet. But it may be happening. My clients don't all hand me their department's incentive plans.
Maybe that's something we should add to the list,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I'd love it if they would.
Give you
Sure.
some more insight. Now, when we think about, we talked about the incentive why, and we talked about some of the strategies procurement might follow. Let's take it the next step in and talk about some of the specific categories of spend where you've seen some of these strategies play out. Both in terms of illustrating the benefits that it can generate, but also for people that are joining us that are sort of thinking through, okay, where might I apply this? What might I find if, for instance, I were to go do a retroactive audit? Can you give me some example categories of spend where you've seen procurement have, or at least try to have, a top line impact?
Well, I think the categories that are most ripe for making top line impact. And I'll say a couple things that probably are relatively obvious, but it's worth
Sure.
saying. Higher margin, categories on the supplier side are probably better opportunities than really, really tight margin categories. If you've got a commodity that you've squeezed down to, an especially thin margin, you're likely working with a supplier that isn't also gonna scratch you $1 million check on the front end of a commitment and also throw in a pony. They're probably already
Yeah.
just barely covering their costs and scratching out whatever acceptable profit is uh, to them. So and this probably guides you to the arena of expenses that we work in. Indirect services tend to be much higher margin categories
Yeah.
due to their complexity, due to their in some cases lower overall dollar over monetary impact profile, and so, but I would add another element. I think multi-year categories. In other words, categories where multi-year supplier commitments are the norm, where you're signing 3 to 5 year contracts. I think these categories are especially ripe for revenue generation opportunities. And the reason I say that is because every 3 to 5 years, there's this one moment in time where
Yeah.
the big commitment gets made. And I think if your hand is played right, that one moment in time can be capitalized on, not only from an effective expense management standpoint, but also to generate some revenue in the process. So I think those are the categories that are most ripe: high margin, multi-year supplier commitment categories.
One of the things that comes to mind for me, and maybe this is semantics, but as I think through, okay, which categories, especially with the retroactive auditing, I feel like there's a chance that some of these activities might already be happening, but procurement is thinking about them in the context of supplier performance management. So, for instance, a specific example that comes to mind for me is if you're working with third party legal services and you go back through the billing, and of course, you've got partner billing at one rate. This would also work for consulting, a relatively junior legal associate billing at another rate. It takes time, but if you can reconcile the complexity or value of the task with the hourly rate of the person that that provider chose to have deliver it, and therefore your effective cost to have the same exact task performed, we might be thinking of that as oversight or ensuring performance, ensuring compliance with the service levels in the contract without necessarily realizing we have the opportunity to message that internally as also being revenue generating if we're able to find something. Now, if you do a retroactive audit and you find, hey, everything's great, maybe you don't have the revenue impact, but you might be able to say, hey, this is a real success story. This is an amazing external service partner that we're working with. Procurement gets part of the credit for that. The business gets part of the credit for being part of selecting them. But I actually think that as you start to talk more and more about these strategies, this is not necessarily new work. It's a new perspective on work that we either know we should be doing or potentially are doing. It's just as much about how we think about it and then how we communicate what we find to other people within the business.
Well, the magic words that you said in all that were "if you have the time" or "if you can find the time."
Exactly.
Because of course, that's the rub in almost every
I
procurement
know.
department I encounter. And of course, the conundrum is too that the more time passes between, in a perfect world, you're managing expenses as you incur them. And if you're doing that effectively, the retroactive audit's never necessary. And if we could get to some of the problems with retroactive auditing, for example, first of all, the more time that passes, the more cumbersome and time consuming
That's
the
right.
endeavor is going to be. Most of the companies, I think outsourcing these retroactive audits is the norm, in
Yeah.
part because nobody has the time, and there's an expertise and know-how element too. But the problem is, once 2 or 3 years have passed, you're retroactively auditing what happened with an expense that's gone astray over the last 3, 4, 5 years. You're going to find a couple of things. You'll find some black and white overcharging, at least in the categories we deal in. That's there's not perfect contract compliance with indirect services. You're also going to find, though, and you find them in about equal measure. There's black and white overcharging, but there's also gray area stuff that when you say it out loud, you don't like it. You don't like the
Mhm.
sound of it, but your supplier may technically have had the right to do what they did.
Mm,
Okay. And so the gray area in a retroactive audit, I mean, right, forget it. You're never getting that money back. You have no claim to it. If you're going to a supplier and saying, I don't like this thing you did 2.5 years ago, but I guess you may have technically had the right to do it, but I'd like the money back. That's not going to work.
yeah, good
In
luck with
fact,
all that.
right, even as it relates to the black and white stuff, you know, in our experience, most of the time, a retroactive audit yields recovery of somewhere between 10 and 30% of even black and white overspending, clear and obvious
Mm,
overcharging by your supplier. And what it ends up serving as is a reminder that it's so much easier to keep a dollar from leaving the building
That's
than it
right.
is to get it back once it does.
Yeah,
And so in general, now I'll get to this later because I think we're going to talk about some stuff that does work. I'm not saying there's no place for retroactive auditing. There actually are some ways that it can be used effectively. I'll put a pin in that for now. But
yeah,
anyway, yeah, I think the conundrum, as you allude to, is if you have the time, because if everybody had the time they really need, they'd be managing effectively in real time as opposed to
exactly.
periodically trying to fix a problem. Yeah.
Well, let's stay with this train of thought then around things that sound like great ideas, but in reality aren't actually going to work. So, you talked about sort of the most common strategic practices that you see around revenue generating activities. What are some of the catches? What's the space between, yes, this sounds like a great idea. Certainly, we've talked about the challenge of time, but what other things sit in that gap between an idea being great and the effect that it's actually going to generate if procurement goes down that road?
You know, uh, okay, so just sticking with the theme of um, overburdened and understaffed procurement departments, what
Yeah.
I've seen so often in recent years is category manager doesn't really have the bandwidth to take a deep dive into a particular category to arm him or herself with the leverage that's probably there lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah.
There probably is leverage they could take into whether a direct negotiation with an incumbent, into an RFP process. But get finding that leverage and figuring out how to use it and aligning the forces on your team to effectively use it all takes time. And so and they often don't have it. So
Yeah.
what I often am seeing, and by often I mean I've lost count of how many times I've seen that the category manager will say, look, just give me a signing bonus and I'll give you the new 3 to 5 year extension. And what ends up happening is, and we're so often coming in after this has happened 2 or 3 years ago, and we're
Yeah.
digging through the rubble of what's happened in the category since then. We'll see that they got 2%, 1 to 4% of contract value
Yeah.
of their new commitment, 3 to 5 year commitment value on the front end of a deal, and that was the trade-off for overspending to the tune of 20 to 40% over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. It's objectively a bad trade when
Yeah.
when you see that those numbers are favorable to the supplier. But I understand the hand is forced sometimes where the buyer's like, what can I do? And I would say, and we could have spent an hour on this. We don't have enough time to do that, but let's also not pretend that certain flies in the ointment of procurement department incentive plans don't also encourage this
Right.
behavior. When there is an outsized priority placed on the short term, that trade-off of a $200,000 signing bonus now in exchange for overspending by 2 to 4 million over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, that may actually look appealing to the category manager given the way their comp plan works, which of course I would argue is problematic, but
Yeah.
it's frequently the case.
And it's frustrating too because we know that these category managers may not know how bad the deal is, but they definitely know it's not a great deal. And
Mhm.
it's so frustrating because whether it's the constraint of time or whether it is a compensation plan, you're put in this situation where you're thinking, in a perfect world, right? You said it's the magic words, if there were more time. Well, now we're in a perfect world. If I could do more, is there more money here? Absolutely. But at
Yeah.
some point, you just have to drop it and go. And that's how we end up in these situations where suppliers, frankly, have the upper hand, whether it's about category expertise or the time that they're able to dedicate to a deal. And it puts us at a natural disadvantage.
100%. I mean, and look, it's not the worst thing you could do. I've seen plenty of cases where that bad deal automatically renewed and nobody got anything for the
Yeah.
next 3 to 5 year commitment. So it's better to get 1 to 4% of contract value in the form of a signing bonus, I suppose. But you're right. There is everybody I talk to in procurement, I think, understands like that bandwidth constraints have severely hindered their
Yeah.
ability to effectively manage expenses, and they're looking outside their walls increasingly. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, are there any? So we've talked about the strategies, we've talked about the characteristics of the categories of spend. If we come back to strategies for a minute, Is there anything that's sort of tried and true? Like if you were going to do something to explore whether this is possible, to make a business case for getting resources to do more of it, is there anything that's sort of like a proven, this is probably going to work for you?
Yeah, of course, what I'm about to describe isn't simple. It takes time and expertise, but I alluded earlier to the fact that there are cases where a retroactive audit can really be useful. Um,
Yeah.
the specific scenario that I'm thinking of, but it's actually a very common scenario, is you have a supplier that you desire to retain, and you're coming to the end of a 3 to 5 year, agreement term. And when I say coming to the end, let's hope you're a year to 18 months out, so you got time to do it right.
Not the literal end. Yeah.
Right. It's one of the frequent problems is like, oh
Yeah,
God,
that's
four
true.
four months left in this agreement. Let's take some action. Now it's too late. You're losing leverage by
Yeah.
the day. But um, I think if you're out in front of it enough, a retroactive audit of a supplier that you desire to retain can be a great precursor to a negotiation.
Mm,
And maybe you're even running an RFP, and maybe your company protocol even requires it up to, for certain dollar figure category commitments. But I view the retroactive audit as a very effective tool. If you're not going to get emotional about the findings, and if you're not going to let them like change your mind, because I think one thing I'm always reminding clients is like the stuff that happened under this supplier's watch probably would have happened under their leading competitors' watches too.
yeah.
So let's just accept that we're going to find some ugly stuff as we go through this, but let's accumulate leverage that can help put us in a position of strength as we enter into this upcoming negotiation, and then figure out how to use the leverage that we've accumulated.
Mm,
But let's not just settle on, okay, the whole give me 2% of contract value in exchange for a new 3 to 5 year bad deal.
yeah.
Let's use the leverage to and the discoveries made in that audit to shine a light on the areas of the program, the contract and the continuous management that need to be improved. But let's also say, look, we're going to the supplier. I think we our firm has often put it something like, look, this is a refund. This is money you owe back.
Yeah.
We can call it a signing bonus on the front end of a new deal, but this is money owed.
Yeah.
And I that retroactive audit puts us in that
Mm.
position of being able to to come with strength to the negotiation. So I think that's an effective tool.
Yeah. Now, if we think of the bigger picture of all this, certainly some procurement teams will do it because they know the opportunity is there. Some procurement teams will do this because they're ambitious, right? You talked about this being a great gateway to leadership roles, but there's actually something at stake here. Like when we think about procurement finding a way to make this work, being
Mhm.
successful in this area, what is actually at stake for procurement when it comes to top line impact?
Well, it's there. It's consider the fork in the road. If you're a
Yeah.
department that is continuously making bad trade-offs, even if they work with your department's incentive plan. They allow you to kind of make your numbers in a given year, so you're placing outsized priority on the short term, and you're continuously making bad trades that compromise the business's long-term position, and the
Yeah.
stakeholders really over time aren't really seeing value, aren't really seeing improvement. You're kind of riding this roller coaster of getting a little bit every few years and then watching costs escalate, because the deals that you're executing aren't ultimately protecting the company's long-term interests.
Yeah.
That's a department that loses credibility over time. And yet, if you are doing it right, using kind of the scenario we just described, there's opportunities for procurement to sign their name to some high profile big wins
Mm,
where you've not only made a top line impact, but part of the narrative should also be, and we discovered the areas where our historic efforts at managing this expense were substandard, and we've improved them, and going forward our stakeholders can expect to see better value coming out of our department because of this exercise that we went about. I mean, those are two radically different. You do those two things repeatedly, you end up being either a department that has an awful reputation or a department that has a great one.
Well, and speaking of that, there's actually a great question David has asked specific to retroactive auditing. I think you had talked in a slightly different context. Whenever you dig, you're going to find something ugly, right? And there's usually plenty of ugliness to go around. Nobody comes out squeaky clean. Do you ever see procurement organizations being concerned about everything that's going to be learned in a retroactive audit, that it might not just be something about opportunities to become more efficient or more accurate with the provider, but that there might actually be something going on the buy side of that situation that's problematic as well? Do you see any fear or concern about what might be uncovered?
Most definitely. Yeah. I mean, it is a great question, and it's just, it's reality. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have seen, first of all, we have made discoveries before working with corporate folks that revealed, plant level problems, where there was, untoward activity going on
Yeah.
the buy side that was brought to light. Um, I've also seen many companies choose not to act. I've asked the question many times through the years: if we were to discover A, B, C, and X, Y, and Z, this level of overspending, this level of overcharging,
Right.
examples of mismanagement, would you even want to know? Like I've sometimes had to just ask that question because I'm like, I'm not sure you do. And hopefully, forward thinking, procurement professionals that have a vision for their, not only their personal future but their department's future, that goes beyond, just keeping their job, will say, yes, I want to know, I want to take
Yeah.
action, I want the truth, I want to learn, I want to help our business get better over time. That to me is the essence of where the department needs to be aiming. But yeah, I've certainly seen resistance or reluctance to act for fear of what will be found. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting thing too. And it's a good reminder that when we talk about top line impact, we're talking about the whole company objectives, goals, culture, ethics, values. That in fact, regardless of what procurement wants to do, if you're working for a company that doesn't want to know if something is going wrong, there is nothing you're meaningfully going to be able to do about that top line. There has to be a willingness on everybody's part, a culture where it's better to find a mistake and fix it than it is to allow it to linger and potentially get worse. And I think as procurement steps beyond savings and spend under management and starts thinking about how we can affect the financial health of the whole company, some of those bigger picture things come into mind. And it may be through having these conversations, we're going to learn something about the company we work for that we wouldn't have known otherwise.
Well said, Kelly.
Awesome. Well, Rich, this has been a really interesting conversation. I like this idea of sort of pushing procurement out of the comfort zone, thinking very specifically about how can we do more? How can we have impact in different ways? I appreciate the fact not only that you sort of picked this topic out as an important one to focus on, but that you brought your expertise and were able to share it with us today.
Well, thank you as always for having me, Kelly. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you as well to everybody who's joined us today live, who will be listening in or watching later on demand. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you being here. If you have any questions about today's content, reach out to us, reach out to me, reach out to Rich. We certainly look forward to hearing from you. And we hope to have you join us for future Art of Procurement events. Thanks so
Have a
much,
good day,
everybody.
everybody.